In today's lab, we're doing an experiment with Archimedes' principle. So when an object is submerged in a fluid, there's going to be fluid pressure that presses in on all sides of that object. The pressure on the sides is the same, so it cancels out. But the pressure on the top and bottom is different. There's more pressure on the bottom than on the top, and so this difference in pressure is equal to rho g h. Rho is the fluid density, g is gravity, and h is the height of the object. Now this difference in pressure creates what we call a buoyant force, or a force that pushes the object up. And if we wanted to calculate that, then we multiply both sides of the equation by area, the cross-sectional area of the object. And if we do that, we get the buoyant force is equal to rho g v, where v is the volume of the object, or the volume of the displaced fluid. But rho g v is also the weight of the displaced fluid. So we could say that the buoyant force is equal to the weight of the displaced fluid. And that's what Archimedes' principle says. So we could just stop there and use that equation for the experiment, but if we take it just a little bit further, we can also say that the buoyant force is equal to the fluid density divided by the object density times the object weight. Now if we vary the object weight and measure the resulting buoyant force, we can determine the experimental value for the object density. So that's what we're going to do for this experiment. We're going to use pennies for the weights and then measure their buoyant force and determine their experimental density. Then we can compare that density to the predicted density for the type of pennies that we're using. So unfortunately, you can't just look up what is the density of pennies because it has changed over the years. The composition or the materials that they've used to make pennies has not always been the same. So before 1982, back to some year, it was one composition. And then from 1982 onward, it was another composition. So you're probably not going to have very old pennies, so you probably won't have to worry about that. So we just need to look at whether it's before or after 1982. So before we can do anything else, we just need to take all of our pennies. If you have them bundled up in groups of 10, then you need to break them up, and we need to sort them all by year. So if it was before 1982, put it in one category. If it was after 1982, put it in a different category. And if you have any from 1982, you have to pull those ones out. We can't use those because they changed the composition partway through the year. So you're not going to know based on the year what that composition is. So any from 1982, take those out, and then separate all of the pre-1982 and post-1982 pennies. So that's what I'm going to do now with mine. Now I've got all of these separated, and I just need to sort them by year. So if you're not familiar with pennies, just look on the front side where you have the face of Abraham Lincoln and look for the year there. So you're going to sort these by before 1982, after 1982, and then any from 1982, just pull those ones out. All right, so I finished sorting these. These are from before 1982, these are 1982, and then all of these are after 1982. So I need to set these ones aside, the 1982 pennies, I can't use these. But the rest of them now, you want to identify which group is your largest. And obviously for me, it's the after 1982, the post-1982 group. So identify that, set the other smaller group to the side. You're not going to use these pennies. Once you've selected which pennies you're going to use, whether pre-1982 or post-1982, then look up the table in your lab instructions and find the density for that group of pennies. Now if you have more than 80 pennies remaining, you can just take away the extra pennies so that you only have 80 to work with. And if you have less than 80, then that's fine. Just work with what you've got. But since I have more than 80 pennies, I'm going to take these extra ones and set them aside. So now what you want to do is divide these into 4 equal groups. So since I have 80 of these, each of my groups will have 20 pennies in them. And if you have less than 80, then just divide them up into 4 roughly equal-sized groups. If they're not exactly equal, that's fine, but just try to get them as close as possible. So I'm going to divide these up into groups of 20, and then we're going to tape them together. Now I've got the pennies sorted into 4 groups with 20 pennies in each group, and obviously if you have less than 80 pennies, then your groups are going to be a little bit smaller. So now what we need to do is use Scotch tape and retape them like we had before. And probably don't use, don't try to group 20 of them with just one piece of tape. That'll be a little too hard. So do them in, say, groups of 10 and then tape the groups of 10 together. So that's what I'm going to do now. So when you do this, just make sure to press the tape in tightly against the pennies. If there's any air that gets trapped under the tape, that's going to mess up our densities. So it'll act like the density of the pennies is less than it actually is. So just try to press the tape in and squeeze out any bubbles in the tape that you can so that it's a nice tight bundle with no extra air trapped between the tape. Now I've got these retaped in stacks of 10, and I suppose if you had less than 80 pennies you were working with, then your stacks are going to be less than 10, but that's fine. Now what we need to do is take our heavy-duty sewing thread, and we need to make these little short sections with loop knots on the end of each one. But in order to make these, I would recommend you cut off some lengths about 20 to 25 centimeters long. This is longer than you're going to need eventually, but if you try to tie loop knots on the end of really short strings, it's going to be next to impossible. So cut off some slightly longer ones, and then you can cut off the extra if you need to later. So just cut them to length, tie the loop knots on each end, and then when you finish you should have 4 sections with loop knots on the end of each one. So if I set this here against the table, maybe you'll be able to see it. So it should be about this long when you finish, and hopefully they'll all be about the same length. The ones I did here are not exactly the same length, but they're close. So they're all maybe in the range of, I don't know, 10 to 15 centimeters long after I've tied the knots on there. So something like that is going to be good. Now we have one of these for each of these groups of pennies. So just put them with that, and then we're going to use tape and tape the 2 stacks of pennies and the threads together in a specific way here. So just stack the pennies, the penny stacks, one on top of the other like that, and then you're going to take your thread and kind of just set it directly on top of the stack like that, so that the center of it is centered over the pennies, and then you want to just tape everything together with one piece of tape. So what I decided to do here is I just put the tape down first, and then I put the thread on there, and then the pennies on top of that. So then I can just wrap the tape around the entire thing, and I think that might just be a little bit easier. And also make sure when you're doing this to smooth the tape in and avoid any trapped air bubbles, just like we did before, because any air trapped is going to mess it up later. Alright, so now I've got this finished. I've got the 2 stacks together like this, and then the thread loops like this. So you have 2 thread loops, and then when we use these with the spring balance, we're just going to put them together so that it makes a handle like that. The last thing we need to do with the penny groups is label them, and the reason for this is we need to know which one is which if the weights are a little bit different, so this will be the order that we use them in. And I'm just going to use a Sharpie for this. You can label them however you want. I'm just going to write on the tape on the bottom of each one, so I'll just label them 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now we just need to weigh them, so grab the spring balance, make sure you zero it, and we are going to weigh these in a specific order. So we're going to first of all do number 1, then we're going to add number 2, so we'll have 1 and 2 together, then we'll add number 3 and we'll have 1, 2, and 3 together, and then we'll add number 4 and we'll have 1, 2, 3, and 4 together, and we'll record each one of those weights. So we're not recording the weights of each group, but we're going to record the weights, the combined weights of 1, 1 and 2, 1, 2 and 3, and then 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let me just grab a piece of paper right here, and we can write these down as we go. So just suspend it like this from the spring balance, and then record your force in newtons. So we're not actually measuring mass this time. We're going to measure the weight in newtons. Now without taking this one off, we're going to add the number 2 weight. So again, just add the loops for that, and hang it with the first one. Then just like before, we're going to add the number 3 weight to this, and again record the weight in newtons. And last we'll do the number 4 weight. So just add that to all the rest and record the total weight again in newtons. Now you just need to weigh these in water. So let me set this down for a second and then grab a container that you can fill with water. I'm going to use this glass jar. If you have something transparent, that would be ideal, so you can look inside and see if there's any air bubbles trapped on the pennies. The important thing though is to make sure that the pennies can fit inside there. So they need to be able to sit below the water surface and not touch the sides of the jar or the bottom of the jar. So just a second, I'm going to go fill this with water and I'll be right back. Along with your water, make sure that you have some towels. This is likely to make a mess or drip or something, so just have these handy so that you can dry things off as you go. Before we can do anything else, we need to submerge the pennies in the water. So just place them down in the water. You can leave them attached to the spring balance, but just put them down in there, and then you want to jostle it or tap it. If you have, I could grab the Sharpie here and just kind of tap them. So if you look closely on there, you can see some bubbles attached. There's one right there in the center, and you'll notice if I tap this a little bit, I can get that bubble to loosen and float up to the surface. So just make sure you kind of jostle these around a lot, get all the bubbles to dislodge and go up to the surface. And just be patient with this step. Just kind of keep jostling them and poking them. Do what you need to do so that you get all the air released and you're not affecting the density that way. Another thing you might try while you're doing this is just kind of bounce it up and down here on the spring balance. So you can just see if any more bubbles come off that way. And once you're not getting any more bubbles to come off, then you're probably good. Once you've gotten as much of the air released as you can, keep them below the water surface. If you bring them back up, more air is going to get trapped and you'll have to do that part again. So now we just need to weigh them, and we're going to do this in the reverse order as what we did before. So first of all, we're going to weigh them all together. Then we'll remove number 4 and weigh 1, 2, and 3 together. Then we'll remove number 3 and do 1 and 2 together. And then we'll remove number 2 and do 1 by itself. So first of all, just lift them up so that they're still below the water surface, but they are above the bottom of the jar. And then record the force in newtons. Once you record that force measurement, you need to remove the number 4 weight and check your labels so that you remove the correct one when you do this. I got my number 4 out, so now I just need to weigh 1, 2, and 3 together. I got my number 3 weight out, so now I just need to weigh 1 and 2 together. So again, I'll lift this back up and record the force in newtons. Last, I need to remove the number 2 weight and weigh number 1 by itself. So again, I'll suspend this in the water so it's below the surface, but above the bottom of the jar. And that's it for the data collection. Now, when you finish everything, make sure to break these apart and completely dry off the pennies. And then if you need them taped in groups again for future labs, you'll have to do that at that time. And as always, read your instructions carefully. They will have more information than what is shared in this video. And good luck on your experiment.